Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Teaching Academy PD workshop. Today marks the first of a series of workshops being run around supervised assessment. So we've had heavy enrolments for this one, which is great. We expect to see that in this and following sessions on supervised assessment. Today's session is on conducting your supervised assessment, and it's going to be run by Kelly Shaw from the Division of Learning and Teaching, with myself, Elise and Beck also sort of in the background facilitating in different ways. If you do have questions, etc., through the session, by all means pop them into the chat and one of us will get to those. There may be time for questions, etc., towards the end, time depending. The session is being recorded and the slides, the recording, etc., will be made available to everybody after the event within about half an hour or so. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kelly and yeah, let's go.
Okay, thanks, Lachlan. Before we commence, I would just like to do the acknowledgement to country. So if we could pop to the next slide, please, and welcome everyone. We would like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and the sustained custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. We acknowledge their wisdom and their many varied contributions across the generations. Collectively, as staff of Charles Sturt, we pay our respects to all First Nations people, past and present. And I'm joining from Wiradjuri country this morning. Beautiful day. So thanks, Elise. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is obviously an overview of what we're going to be covering in today's session. I'd first like to do a quick thanks to my colleagues across DLT and the leadership for all the support that has been provided in the lead up to today's session, because the supervised assessment space is moving very quickly and it's constantly evolving. And also thank you to those of you who are in attendance today, because it's the first week of session, so it's obviously also a busy time for everyone. I think it's the first week of session. And also I'd like to acknowledge all the work that's already been done in preparation for this session by academics and course directors in what was in many cases under very tight time frames. And that is no doubt what brings you here today to the PD, to get a feel for what this is actually going to look like. DLT has had the privilege of supporting a lot of that recent work, and for many subjects, this is the first time that they're implementing supervised assessment in some form or other. So well done to everyone that applies to, and if you're attending this session for future planning, then I'd like to welcome you also. So hopefully everybody's had a chance to glance over what we're going to cover today. Obviously, it's not an exhaustive list, and as we began planning for this session, we definitely struggle with kind of putting parameters around what we would cover today, because there is obviously a lot that we want to get through. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just a little context setting. As you're no doubt aware, the changes in assessment practices are being driven from the top down by TEXA. And I think it's fair to say, and in conversations that we've been having in DLT, that this is more or less a generational change that we are in the midst of. And as such, it's probably not going to be without a few teething pains. Having said that, and although this has been a disruptor, I suppose, to business as usual, it seems that overall, from what we're seeing and hearing and reading, that supervised assessment is generally a very positive experience, both for academics and students, which is great to hear. So we've had academics saying, particularly for people who might have been teaching by a distance, like it was really a great opportunity to actually have a chat to my students and get to know them and kind of see the face that may have had camera off and been attending sessions or just kind of dipping in and out of the Brightspace site. So I'm sure most people are kind of familiar with the concept of the learning pit, but I think for many of us, or for many people, we're kind of in that learning zone with supervised assessment. Just a couple things also want to point out on this slide is as I said, the feedback has generally been positive, but also there's a link in here to the recent University of Sydney AI Symposium recordings. And there's lots of variety in terms of the subject matter that was covered in supervised assessments or interactive oral. So it's really worth a look. They're all kind of like bite size. They're all about like 15 minutes, I think. So if you get a chance and you're interested, it's definitely well worth looking at some of the recordings and grabbing some of the takeaways from that. Okay. So now we're going to, thanks, Elise. Yes, flick onto a quick Menti. And I don't know about anybody else who was teaching online during COVID, but it's a bit nostalgic now. What cat are you feeling? Um, the sheep scale might have been used at one stage during COVID. So if you just want to take a second and pop into the Menti and see gauge how people might be feeling about supervised assessment. Thanks, Lachlan. And while people are maybe taking a moment to decide which cat they are, I'll just add a couple of points of clarification. Polite panic. So a big part of this experience for both academics and students will obviously be around the pre-work, some of which is obviously you're here attending today. That's part of that. Part of that is also going to be framing the narrative for students by providing them with some appropriate support prior to the implementation of the actual supervised assessment itself. And these topics will be covered in a lot more detail in some of our upcoming Teaching Academy sessions, PD sessions. So I'm really going to only touch upon aspects of those strategies that are more student focused today. And second of all, while supervised assessment events have already been deployed via subject outlines for this session, there are some people here who might be attending today who are brand new to the approach or doing some forward planning for session 60. So hopefully there'll be some good tips for both of you, whether it's this session or next. Okay, so polite panic seems to have won the Menti meter today, but a good spread across all the different areas. Does anybody want to add anything or have any questions at this stage? Okay, great. So as I said, there are several upcoming sessions related to supervised assessment, but the aim of today is just to give you that broad overview of what it looks like and how it can be deployed. So now we're going to start looking at some of the more practical informations and tips, and there'll be some resources peppered throughout. And yeah, without further ado, we're going to jump straight into the practicalities. So we're going to start looking at identity verification. Thanks, Elise. It's my slide driver today. So students will be prepped for this in advance, but basically these are the key takeaways or the considerations. Now, one of the good, I suppose, safeguards in the system is that when they go into Teams to book, that it will automatically match whatever name they've been enrolled under. Beck, did you want to clarify any of that or talk about any of that? Are you happy?
No, just to kind of speak to the fact that what we're trying to achieve with the identity verification is really just citing some photographic ID. There will be some information available for student facing, but it really is a small part of what we're trying to do, and it will only take place in a one-on-one session. So we're not looking for this to be done in group settings. And what we're really doing is just looking for some really low level authentication. So there are obviously a lot of other things that students at Charles Sturt do to verify their identity when they enroll, and a lot of those other pieces, and particularly for different types of assessments. So this is something that we're just looking to implement as an additional layer of assurance, but certainly is something that we are treating not as an incredibly formal part of supervised assessment. But we did want to give some guidance around what to expect, particularly for academic staff, and also we have some guidance that will be going student facing as well. So we have also wanted to support the capacity for this. Oh, I'm sorry. I see in the chat. So we wouldn't do it for group-based supervised assessment because we wouldn't want students showing their ID in front of other students. So for group-based, we are not pursuing identity verification, but in one-on-one settings, we are, because there is that privacy and ease of flow for the process of the assessment. So we are going to walk through a bit more information. Kelly will walk us through that and some of the support resources that we have. If you do have questions about this, please do feel free to pop them in the chat, or if you do want to come off mute, I'm sure Kelly's happy to take questions out loud as well. Thanks, Kelly.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think one of the considerations about how Teams is configured, that this is my understanding, so Beck, correct me if I'm wrong, but it will basically automatically prompt the student to enroll or book in whatever name they're enrolled in. Just getting to Laura's
No,
question.
so sorry, Kelly, that's not the case. So students will be guests in Teams. They will be prompted to put their name in, and we will be suggesting that they use that name. It will be able to be verified against the enrollment information in Brightspace and other sources as well. But as they are guests, they can enter
With whatever.
a name. But there will be information on the student-facing various websites, but also on some of the sample information we're suggesting in some of our other sessions for ways to go about that with the students. So there won't be that, but there is still obviously the only way that they will get the link to bookings is through Brightspace, which means they'll have to be a verified student to be able to log in and sign in and access that platform.
Great, thanks. And just to Laura's question, who asked that she's had a lot of issues with students having different names due to marriage, etc. And yeah, we had very similar conversations about trying to manage that. And I was saying, like, having been obviously a teacher, a classroom teacher, you get somebody on the roll whose name is Charlotte, and you call out Charlotte, and then you get your head taken off because they go by Lottie or whatever it might be. So I think there'll still be probably some things to manage around that, and obviously marriage and those sorts of issues create another layer. So, okay. So also, as Beck has mentioned, that there is a resource on this. Alice, did you want to, sorry, Elise, did you want to show us the resource that's been?
Can you see that on screen now, Kelly?
Yeah, I can. Thank you very much. Okay, so that will basically kind of walk us through what needs to happen in the form of a checklist and verifying ID. And again, the links to all of these resources are in this PowerPoint, which will be available shortly after the end of this session. Okay. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Now, if you haven't already had a chance to look at the Supervised Assessment website, web pages or website pages within our DLT pages, there's more information here. So general information about conducting a supervised assessment, which I believe is where these resources are going to sit. And there are some student-facing resources that have been created, and I think there are still more to come or more in the works. But again, we might need more clarification around that. Beck, did you want to talk about any of the student-facing?
Yeah, so there is some student-facing information that's currently available, which I think will be coming too. But there will also be some information that will be available in Brightspace where we provide the booking link should online subjects need that. So that will also have some additional student-facing information as well as some links off to some resources to support students with technical troubleshooting or preparing for their supervised assessment. So there will be that information and there'll be some communications about that when it's coming out.
Right. Thank you. And just as a reminder, and thank you, Elise, for driving us around the pages and the resources that are already up. And just as a reminder there, as I said, there's lots of resources across the DLT web pages. So if you get time, particularly if you're in the planning stages for session 60 or beyond, definitely have a look at the types of supervised assessment. And obviously, if you want more support or need some more questions answered, please feel free to log a Sherwell. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, scripts and tools. And again, we're coming bearing gifts. So there's more resources of checklists and sample PDFs that you can use coming from that site. The checklist has been developed to basically meet all the requirements, particularly when you're under time pressure. It's a new format for a lot of people. As part of quality assurance, to drive consistency and fairness across the different cohorts for both the marker and then obviously the student experience, and to support markers in teams to help ease the burden and duplication of effort. So rather than everybody trying to kind of come at this their own way, we've got a little bit of consistency there. So the checklist will provide a bit of a skeleton structure of what needs to be included, and includes the identity verification, as you may have been able to tell, and the all directive. I said the all important of hitting the record button, because I think we've all been guilty of forgetting to do that. The checklist obviously is more that high level support of things to do and not to forget, and essentially will work more or less alongside or dovetail with your prepared assessment questions, so that you can kind of use this for the outline, and then obviously your questions specific to your assessment will be generated by yourself or your team. Anybody have any questions at this stage? I would to keep going. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so just again, some more tips and things to consider. It's always best practice to ensure that the questions planned for your supervised assessment actually support the learning outcomes. And again, while this may sound obvious, in designing a rubric and considering the application of knowledge, it can be tempting, I think, to include a criterion that has to do with communication skills or articulation of ideas or similar, because it's an oral assessment. But obviously, these things shouldn't really be assessed unless they genuinely support and can be evidenced in the learning outcomes. So there is obviously probably a bit of a gray area around that. We were having the discussion or conversation about, we see a lot of rubrics that have referencing and articulation of ideas or structure in the marking, but they might not be directly related to an actual learning outcome, but they're part of good academic practice. So I suppose there could be a little bit of gray area with this one as well. And having said that, many courses do have communication skills in either their course learning outcomes or professional standards. But moving forward, it may take some fine tuning of learning outcomes or assessment tasks if they're going to be more directly assessed as part of a supervised assessment. One supervised assessment rubric that we looked at had professional communication in it and engagement with questions. But the rubric was designed in a way that the criteria could easily be applied to another form of assessment. So like a written format or slides or something like that. So it was well designed, I suppose, in terms of meeting the learning outcomes and also kind of being flexible enough to be used in a supervised assessment in a professional conversation. And as a bonus, this subject in particular also had, as part of their professional standards, communication skills or working with clients and things like that. So that obviously was a big boon, or bolstered the inclusion of that in the criteria. And also temporal aspects like quickly responded to questions, that type of criterion really shouldn't feature in. I see a few questions in the chat. Does anybody want to come off mute and ask any questions? All good for now? Okay. Most people are probably familiar with a funnel structure, probably not a new strategy, but just the idea of staging questions when you start to plan for your oral assessment or your supervised assessment is going from more broad to more challenging or specific. One article that I looked at mentioned that students were provided beforehand with an overall structure or format for their assessment. And that was really well received by students and took away some of that anxiety they had about kind of going into this, what feels to them a very big, long 15-minute discussion about something where they might feel that they're on the spot a bit. There is a link at the end in the resources to, I think it's a PDF or basically a resource that was created by Gordon Jofflin. And he outlined 6 dimensions of oral assessment. And it's worth a look, just kind of, particularly if you're doing some future planning, just to kind of get your head around into that space and think about how to, some best practice related to this. And lastly, it's a good idea to obviously have some generic prompting prepared and some more specific follow-up questions. And this may be part of planning. And again, going back to that idea of ensuring kind of fairness and consistency across different markers or across the cohort as a whole. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so some things to kind of be aware of or that we just want to avoid if possible. I think for many of us, there is an instinct to rush in to fill pauses or overtalk or even rush to respond to things. And I think there's probably a certain art to being able to kind of sit with those pauses and give students some time to think if needed. And possibly not a bad idea to prompt students or remind students that they can have that few seconds or that little bit of time to kind of gather their thoughts or get their ducks in a row before they start to verbally respond. And also, we had conversations about for students maybe for whom English is not their first language, this could potentially elevate their nerves a bit. And again, might be worth a gentle reminder that really what we're trying to get them to do in a supervised assessment is show the application of their knowledge, and it's not a test of their language skills or how quickly or how well they are able to articulate themselves. Some academics that we consulted mentioned that a handful of students were definitely underprepared when they came into their supervised assessment. And in one case, the lecturer basically just kind of went to the, just tell me what you know, or just tell me what you can remember about this particular topic. Another said that she structured her later questions over the course of an interactive oral to be more reflective. So then that way that gave the opportunity to students who maybe didn't have as strong an application of knowledge, they were at least able to discuss their own experiences where their responses to other parts may have lacked a bit of content or application. And lastly, I suppose just having an awareness of our own implicit biases when we go in to supervised assessment events. And the quote from Yaffe and Street reminds us of that, even though it's a bit old, but I think it's probably still relevant. Okay, any questions, or if not, I'll move on to I see there's a fair bit in the chat, but I'll keep going and we'll hopefully get time at the end. Next slide, please, Elise. Okay, preventing and triaging some common issues. So again, there's another little gift that's been put up onto the DLT web pages in the form of a little tech check guide. I'll just give Elise a second to flick through to that. And as I said earlier in the session here today, I think that's obviously one of the biggest source, or can be one of the biggest sources of stress or pain points. Is the tech going to cooperate? So there's a troubleshooting guide. And just some things to check. And I'm going to ask Beck, I think you've touched upon this already, but there will be, or there is already a student-facing equivalent that will be
Yeah, so there's
somewhere.
going to be a resource that will be linked into the page we're suggesting subject coordinators have within their Brightspace site that will also provide the link to the booking system. There will be some student-facing information on that, including a guide for them to actually test their technical setup prior to the supervised assessment so that students can be prepared for what they may need to have. So there's some things like we may get them to test their camera, their microphone, those kinds of things. But we will also be ensuring that they have information to access if they do encounter some of these issues as well. So this guide really is for markers to be able to try and provide a little bit of support at the point in time, with also some, if it can't be resolved, what you might want to consider. But there will also be some student companion pieces that will be available.
Right. Thank you for that. Okay, Elise, if you could just pop back to the slide for us. Yes, thank you. Okay, so for students, I don't want to, again, steal any thunder from our upcoming sessions, so I've just included a couple of very basic points here. And if you're implementing supervised assessment for the first time this session, hopefully there hasn't been too much pushback or uncertainty from students yet, although, again, understandable because this is possibly for a lot of them, if not all of them, a new way of being assessed and a new part of the university experience. Again, in talking with academics who've been using interactive orals for some time, students generally come out of the experience with very positive feedback, even if they initially find it quite daunting or were a little bit kind of going, oh God, what's this going to be like? I think there's a possibly a misconception that still exists that they basically are going in and expected to just regurgitate a whole bunch of information that comes from a kind of a very old way that we used to interact with students, very traditional, where really this is more about creating a space to have more of that professional dialogue and that professional conversation. So some academics also used like mock activities and case studies that were similar, obviously, in nature to what they were actually going to use for their supervised assessment or their interactive oral. And again, more of these strategies will be looked at in some of our upcoming PD sessions. But yeah, it's important to emphasize that it's not a grilling, it's just an opportunity for them to showcase their learning. And lastly, we can't forget, and I've been saying this a lot through this experience of moving to more supervised assessments, that we can't forget about the students for whom this way of being assessed will be a real boon. And anecdotally, lecturers reported that many students said that they felt that they actually did better than they anticipated. And many of their results also tracked higher than average overall. And some students felt that they did better on the supervised assessment, or they did do better on the supervised assessment than they may have done in other written assessments or other forms of assessment in the same subject. So again, really good to hear that. For staff, really important, and we again talked a lot about this, that we've talked about the tech check, but the note taking in particular. So whatever format it suits, whether analog or digital, but also probably a good idea to make sure that your student is aware that you go in, that you'll be taking notes, either handwritten or if you're typing or whatever, just so they don't feel a bit neglected. And obviously this will help with feedback and moderation. If you run out of time during your windows in between your supervised assessments, then at least you've got some notes. And again, one of the lecturers that I spoke to who has been using iOS said sometimes she did use the whole time and didn't really like get a chance to kind of collate her feedback straight after the oral. So it was really useful for her to have her notes that she could then refer back to if she kind of had a few back to back. So, okay, next slide, please. And we're going to go to a little see, think, wonder on this one. All right, some very practical tips here. So workstation setup. So just take a second and have a look at this and see what grabs you. Again, from my old teaching days, we used to do see, think, wonder. What do you see? What do you think about this? Is there anything that you wonder about based on this image? And a shout out to my colleague, Nicole Mitchell, who actually had the forward thinking to snap this picture a few years ago when she first started using interactive orals. And that was well before any of us could have anticipated what changes were coming. So, all right, so we'll do the big reveal now. And I'll give you a second to just kind of read some of the annotations here because they're very powerful and they're really good things to think of. Anybody have any questions or comments before we move to the next slide?
Hi, Kelly.
Nikki.
Oh.
Hi. So will markers need 2 screens then?
I suppose it'll come back to how you decide to set up your workspace. I wouldn't say that, I was going to say for casual staff, it could be really challenging because not all of them will have 2 screens. As Beck said, I think it's useful, but not 100% necessary. So this is obviously how Nicole's done hers. And personally, if I were doing this, I would probably, and having been a casual marker for a long time, and again, not always having access to 2 screens, and I'm also old school, I would probably take my notes analog and then just use obviously my laptop or my computer to interact with the student. And again, just making the student aware that I'll be taking notes, I'll be writing down some points as we talk, that sort of thing, just to kind of give them a little bit of context for my body language. The casuals for sure.
Okay, thanks.
No worries. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Lachlan for the next slide, and he is
Hi,
going
Kelly,
to talk
if you don't
about...
mind.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I missed
Before
your
Lachlan
hand.
coming. Yeah, so I understand that sometimes some of these oral presentations or interactions are recorded for moderation purposes, and there could also be instances where students may request for grade change and all of that. So we may have to use that, get an evidence to be able to review those grades. But from what you just mentioned regarding taking notes during the supervised assessment, are you suggesting that just the notes would be enough for moderation and reviewing of grades purposes?
I think I'm going to hand over to Beck for that one because I think we need clarity around, do they, and I think it was in the chat as well, do they need to be recorded?
So obviously if it's happening online, a recording would be great to have, and that's one of the things that we're sort of recommending. However, it's not necessarily a requirement for assessment for you to have a high fidelity copy of the student performance. If we think about things like work placements, we're not recording the entirety of the work placements. We are looking to the notes that are being taken by the person who is observing that particular performance or demonstration of learning. And we're also then referring to the rubric, the feedback that was given to students. So we are trying to make sure that we have artifacts that speak to that academic judgment and evaluation of student performance and what has led to, I guess, how you have rated the student's performance within that particular assessment task, but it is not necessarily a requirement that we have a recording. We do a lot of assessment in person that doesn't necessarily have that replication, if you like. But where it is possible to have a recording of the student's performance as well as notes, as well as the rubric, that may be seen as a really ideal space to be able to then engage with students who do have questions about how their performance was evaluated and how they performed in that particular assessment. So there may be reasons to not record it, even though it's online, as I mentioned earlier in the chat. But as standard, we are suggesting that if you can record it, that you record it. You also take notes, and that just means that you have a variety of pieces of evidence and data, should it become necessary, to be able to draw on those.
All right, thank you so much.
No problem.
Thank
Chris, did you want to?
Yeah, I think I was just going to add something that maybe follows on from what's just been said. So I think, so we've been doing these for a few years, and I think some of the assessments that we do, they're called OSCEs, and in those sessions, I take on the role of a client and the student interacts with me. And I think in those sessions, my headspace is not in the right place to do marking during or immediately afterwards. So what we do in those situations is that I just focus on my role of being the client. I smash through as many students as I can in a day, and then all of those, we record all of them, and then we send the recordings off to markers who, you know, can do it whenever they have the capacity to do so. So I think just to highlight that that's an opportunity as well. I suppose it's not always the case that you have to mark immediately afterwards. Everything still gets done within the amount of hours that I have in academic workload and all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great perspective, Chris. Thank you. Okay. No more questions. I see there's a lot in the chat, which we'll hopefully get some time at the end. But I'm going to hand over to Lachlan now to talk about recordings and artifacts on the next slide. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. And hi, everybody. I can see the chat going wild with lots of questions for us to follow up on. I'm going to give you some general overview information around recordings and artifacts in this space, just so that everyone's on the same page with what we're talking about here. The booking system, and particularly the processes for going through how we work with that and what it means, is something that Beck and I will be covering next Thursday, right? So we have a session that I highly recommend people will come along to. It will be recorded, etc. But specific technical questions relating to that today, you're going to be directed to come along to that next week, essentially. So that's the first part. But let me give you a bit of an overview. The first part is that the booking system itself is Microsoft Bookings. That will be made available to every school to use. You'll have a school's booking area, and each of the events that you set up for your interactive orals and other events, etc., will all be on that school bookings page. Because we're using that system, Microsoft Bookings, the flow-on effect is that it utilizes Microsoft Teams, as we are now, for each of your bookings with the students. So what that means then in terms of recordings is that it will be a Teams recording, and you need to know where that's going to end up. And then we can sort of start talking about what you end up doing with the recording. So I have a few general points to make to that effect. The first one is, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, maybe if you've ever opened up your File Explorer, etc., recordings from Teams, not only do they end up in the chat area if they're made available to participants, for example, they also are saved in the OneDrive folder of the staff that are in that meeting, right? So if you're the marker, for example, in a meeting with a student, the recording from that session will automatically end up in your OneDrive folder. And in fact, just for your reference, I'm going to drop this into the chat. This is what it looks like for me when I do that. If you've ever wanted to just have a quick look at, if I'm saying OneDrive folder, what is that? That's what it looks like. If you open up your Explorer, underneath your name on a CSU device, you'll notice that down there is a folder that's called Recordings. That is your OneDrive Recordings folder, and that's where your Teams recordings are going to end up in the first instance. Those recordings, by default, at Charles Sturt, have 120 days lifespan, where there'll be conversations about what needs to happen with those that I assume you'll end up having with your conveners or within school, etc. We're not getting into that today, but I'm telling you where they end up in the first instance. So you've got 120 days of those files sitting in there. The actual files themselves have quite a specific format for their file names, and that is that the way that you set up your workshop, specifically the name of the event, or we'll start using this term service, because that's what the platform calls them. That will be the first part of the file name of your recording, and the second part will be the student name. So these form quite important considerations for you if you're trying to find those recordings later on. So you need to make sure part of the instructions is certainly the templates, etc., that we provide will all be geared towards quite specifically setting up these events in a particular way so that you can easily locate those recordings when you need to. And I've provided a sample there on this slide about what that might look like and that format to follow. So you can see there's a subject code, there's a session code, there's a task number, a topic name, and the student name comes from when the student makes the booking themselves. You don't need to kind of specify that. That's a part of the bookings process. And then the file that comes from the recording will end up with a name like that. So you can see all of those details there. And if I was looking for a recording later, I could search any of those different parts of that name to be able to find that recording. So the more specific, the better. It's going to make that process easier. Now, this term artifacts is used in this space. And when we're using that term, we're talking not only about the recording, but as both Kelly and Beck have mentioned, it also reinforces why note-taking is so important in this process. It forms one of the main forms of evidence and other artifacts that inform this process, along with things like your rubric. I would say whether you're taking analog or digital notes, it is going to be critical that you are doing that along with the recording, because let's face it, there are going to be instances where potentially the wheels fall off for whatever reason, if a recording button hasn't been hit or people can't locate them for whatever reason, or the quality, for example, of it for whatever reason. There's going to be exceptions where potentially your notes are going to be critically important for all of the reasons why the recording itself is also important. So when we talk about moderation, for example, review of grade, your other quality assurance processes, when you're working through your benchmarking, for example, or returning to the assessment, as Chris was talking about before. I'm well. Let me mute that person. Okay. And so effectively, when you are returning to the assessment, either to finalise the grade or any of those other quality assurance processes I just mentioned, yes, the recording is very important. And if you've got one, that is going to be probably your first stop, but your notes are equally important in that space. Relying entirely on one or the other, I would suggest, is not going to be the best approach. You want to make sure that your rubric, your notes, and the recordings are being taken care of. Now, we'll stress again, just as Beck's put in the chat there, that we are going to be going through from start to finish the bookings process next Thursday, where I will introduce you all to Microsoft Bookings, making a booking through, setting up a booking within the school's booking page, and then the process of what making those bookings looks like for students, and then what we end up with after the fact with our recordings, etc. So again, the technical questions, etc., we will definitely be getting to next Thursday. I'm going to hand over to Beck there. I can see she's got a hand up. So Beck.
Thanks, Lachlan. I did just want to respond to some of the questions that are coming through in the chat. We are not transitioning to Teams for all learning and teaching purposes at this stage, but the reason we are going to be doing quite a lot of support around Teams for the use in supervised assessment is because we are going to be using Microsoft Bookings as our booking and scheduling tool, and it integrates automatically with Teams, which means that as students make a booking, it will generate a unique Teams link for that appointment to take place within. That is the rationale for why we are going to be using Teams if we are using Microsoft Bookings, because we weren't able to obviously engage in an integration between Teams and Zoom. So Zoom will still be the platform that you will use for tutorials and sessions with your students, but the ease of use of having Teams rooms being generated at the point of that booking, and that then being something that you can access from your Outlook calendar and that students can also access from the calendar invite that is sent to them, was seen as an approach that would be beneficial for the booking and scheduling and the ease of use. So just to respond to those pieces, that was pretty much the main deciding factor. Not that Teams or Zoom has particular better functionality, but the convenience that we have. So students will be able to click through from a link in their calendar directly into that Teams room. So that will also be a straightforward approach for them in that event. So we will be talking about this more, as Lachlan and others have mentioned, in our session next Thursday. And we are working with DIT to try and ensure that everyone will have access to that system in time for that session. But we are hopeful that the calendars should be available this week, but the individual accesses we are working through with the faculties. So more than happy to chat about that further in our upcoming session. And we will also be reaching out to people with supervised assessments happening earlier in the session to also ensure that they are comfortable and set up and that things are in place for their students. So there will be more coming on that front, but just to address some of the questions that were coming through around that Teams Zoom element.
Great, thanks, Beck. Okay, we can move to the next slide, please, Elise. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly because we're going to run out of time and there might be some more questions in the chat that we want to take a couple minutes to address. So just a couple of seconds here to consider some of the provocations that relate to our approaches to marking. So acknowledging obviously that marking is influenced by a variety of factors, type of assessment, the size of the cohort, does the subject use casuals, and judging from what's happening in the chat, it seems like there's a fair bit of concern around how this will impact on casuals. And obviously a lot of people, even if there isn't, if casuals aren't used, they still might mark as part of a team. And again, having seen some of the work that was done in the lead up to session 30, it seems like a lot of academics, course directors, subject coordinators have already given these issues a lot of consideration prior to even setting up their assessment, which is fantastic. So I think it's, yeah, just again, a lot of this is probably some business as usual stuff in terms of thinking about how the assessment is designed and how that impacts downstream on the marking that goes along with that. So we're into the home stretch now, so we'll move to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry. One thing about the availability of markers is, thanks, Elise. The availability of markers and how this may potentially impact on students, again, is something that we've been having conversations around. If you have casual markers in your school or in your subject, you'll know that a lot of them work out of hours, work evenings, weekends. So I suppose that those are conversations that will need to be had in terms of how that is utilized or leveraged in terms of structuring and scheduling your time slots for students. Beck, did you want to add anything to that? We just keep going and wait till the end.
There'll be some more sessions that will touch into some of these things, but really with the availability of markers, it is about trying to work through with your marking team when they are going to be able to offer time slots, and then also making sure that you have the time slots to cover the number of students. So that really is the key part to start with, but we will also have some more information and sessions. And if anyone is interested in some more support with that, I know that there are certainly people within the faculties that you can speak to around those sort of scheduling pieces, but we can also support you with some of the elements around the technical piece and what we might recommend with some of those particular arrangements around the multiple marking team.
Great, thank you. Okay, next slide, please, Elise. And again, with moderation, business as usual. So just ensuring that good practice for before, during, and after with regard to moderation. So again, emphasizing the importance of note taking or notes or some sort of, if possible, another record of what's happened during the supervised assessment event, and developing the criterion standards with other markers in your team so that you all have agreement about what you're looking for when you're thinking about an HD or a distinction or a credit or whatever it might be. What else did I want to point out on this one? I think that's about it. If you're check obviously your extremes of marking, moderate across the range of grades. And again, I think I've mentioned this earlier, but in chatting with academics, just kind of anecdotally, some said that, they felt like students did much better. It didn't kind of like fall into that neat bell curve like we sometimes see in marking pools or in marking across a cohort. There were a lot of students who did particularly well when given an opportunity to engage with a supervised assessment. Having done marking pools like on a state level for not at CSU, but in another role, I know that we used to spend a fair bit of time kind of unpacking like what we meant and what we looked for when we were kind of allocating students across the range from like a pass up to an HD. And it could be a useful exercise, and again, might be part of business as usual for most people, but particularly important with teams or when there's multiple cohorts of markings. And again, a lot of that comes out in your moderation and your benchmarking anyway. Okay, final slide from me. So this slide, the first link on this slide, I'm just pointing to a really recent and interesting article that came out from UCID where they did interactive orals to scale with over 400 students in a STEM subject. So if you're new to supervised assessment or interactive orals, I found this interesting because we traditionally, or a lot of people tend to think that it wasn't something that could be done at scale or in mass, and they share all their takeaways and tips and the things that they learned in that process. Again, it is very positively frames the experience, which is again great, and more support for that. It doesn't have to be painful for everybody involved. Again, talking to some of my CSU colleagues who've been using IOAs or interactive oral assessments for some time, they said that a lot of the students echoed that idea that it was much better than they expected, even though they may have had a few jitters or nerves going into it or preparing for it, but they really felt it was an uplift for them by the end of it, which is great. And then lastly, I'll just give you a second to read that quote about the advantage is that you're able to draw out from the student what they do know. And it allows, in this academics experience, easier differentiation. So those that have a really strong grasp of concepts or subjects that you're covering versus students who may have much more comprehensive knowledge of something. So again, another boon. And last slide, please. Just I think we've got one more. Yep. Any questions? We'll got a few minutes now. Beth might be able to answer some of the questions that are in the chat. And if anybody has any more questions, reach out to DLT via Sherwell or to an ED. And if you have any ideas or things you'd like to see addressed in one of our upcoming PD sessions, the Teaching Academy email address is there. Well, thanks very much. That's it from me. And I'll hand over to Beck to see if there's any questions in the chat we want to get time to move through.
I think we've covered a fair few of the subjects in the chat. I've been doing my best. But if there are questions that people would like to come off mute and talk about or ask anything about, more than happy for them to do so.
Catherine Pullman has a question about scheduling supervised assessments in the last week of session.
Yeah, so I've tapped in on that one, and I have said that it is best practice not to schedule sessions during the exam period, given those clashes. But if there is a particular need, I think that it is possible, but I would suggest talking to your associate heads of school or heads of school to make sure that that's something that they're comfortable with, and that you would then obviously offer those time slots, and if students can take them, then they will. So that is probably what I would advise in that sense. I can see there's a question that's come in about any comments on AI use during online oral assessment. I'm happy to take further information about that one, Greg, if it's a specific thing. But if it is about if we would allow the use of generative AI during an online oral assessment, I think that would come down to the design of the assessment, if that was something that was within the parameters of the assessment that you're setting up. But I guess the other side to that question is about why supervised assessment is seen as a way to assure learning that we maybe don't have in more artifact-based assessment. And that comes down to the real-time interaction element of the supervised assessment. So we are able to ask students novel questions that they maybe haven't experienced up until that point, and for them to then respond in real time. It doesn't mean that they are 100% not using generative AI. They could be, but often with verbal fluency and the responses that students are giving in real time, it is very useful data for academics to be able to draw upon to make an evaluation and assurance of student learning. So often when you are conversing with someone, even in an online setting, it is much easier to determine if they are reading a script or trying to buy some time as they get AI to potentially provide them with a response. But if it is personalized enough and in that real-time sense, it does give us I guess a data point around how we can feel in our levels of confidence about how well the response they are giving represents their learning and how that assures that learning. So that is the real driver for supervised assessment in this sense. And so with this, it isn't about catching people using AI. It is actually about that relational piece of talking with our students, getting a variety of assessments across courses so that we have multiple data points of student performance and assurance of learning, so that we can have greater evidence and information to draw upon to be able to support students through their degree. So there are a lot of reasons to engage in supervised assessment, just beyond the ones around wanting to make sure that the person is the person, or to try and mitigate against AI. And I do think that there is also some benefit to being able to ask those really bespoke questions about, that was a really interesting point that you made about this, could you just expand a little more on X or Y? Those are some really great learning opportunities as well. So hopefully that covered it. If not, more than happy for you to come off mute and ask some more. And if there are any other questions that people have, more than happy to take those questions. And yes, Bede, that is true. You will not know if the hesitancy on the student's part is them being nervous or potentially using AI or any other kind of thing. That is where we are looking to build up evidence over time of student performance. We are not necessarily expecting students to be highly skilled at presenting, depending on where they are in their particular qualification as well, but it is a skill that we're looking to move through. So we are looking to use a variety of assessments. We certainly wouldn't recommend going entirely supervised assessments across a course. We are looking for there to be a variety so we get different data points. We are also really supporting the idea of work integrated learning as another option that students can engage in as a form of assessment, as well as where there is real concerns around students and potentially the assurance of their learning, then that is where in-person assessment possibly comes to the front as a way to engage in that. But for some of our subjects and courses, that is quite a significant undertaking to consider intensives or other forms of assessment that take place in that sense. So I would urge you to have some further conversations with your heads of school and faculty leadership around those concerns, particularly where it intersects with particular disciplines. Any other questions that people wanted to ask or pop into the chat? I appreciate we are a little bit over time as well, so if people need to run away, that's fine. There will also be the recording of this session available for you to review and for those who weren't able to attend in person.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Elise.
You're very
and
welcome.
Thank you,
Thanks for your
Lachlan.
help.